Two Swiss men, a sheet of steel, and one weekend in July of 2014 rewrote a piece of knowledge that the Amazon had been carrying for 2,000 years, and that 95% of the human race had forgotten by the time their great-grandparents were born. They did it with a pair of tin snips and a welder. The shape they cut was a circle. The circle, when they bent it, became a cone. And that cone, when they lit a fire on top of it instead of underneath it, turned out to be the missing piece of a recipe most of the planet has been hunting for since 1542. I want to tell you about that cone tonight. I told you last time about the temperature line, 400 degrees Celsius. Below it, you keep the carbon. Above it, you lose it to the sky. I told you that the old Amazonians knew that number with their hands, and that smallpox killed the carriers of the knowledge faster than the next generation could learn the trick. What I did not tell you, because I promised it for tonight, is how you actually walk that line in a backyard, with a piece of steel, in June, in your own yard, without setting anything on fire that you do not want to set on fire. Listen, there is a reason no one talks about this anymore, and the reason is not because it is hard. The reason is because the people who knew the shape died, and the people who came afterward built reactors instead of cones. The two men I am going to tell you about are not the heroes of this story. The cone is the hero. The men are the archaeologists who happened to dig it up from underneath 2 centuries of industrial chemistry. Their names are Hans Peter Schmidt and Paul Taylor. Schmidt is a Swiss soil scientist who runs the Ithaka Institute in the canton of Valais, in a valley not far from where the Rhone runs out of the Alps. Taylor is an Australian engineer who wrote the standard handbook on biochar called the Biochar Revolution. In the summer of 2014, the two of them met in Switzerland with one practical problem. Industrial biochar reactors cost $40,000 and up. Most of the world could not afford one. Most of the world also had biomass falling off its trees every autumn and dead soil underneath those trees that needed exactly what biochar could do. The math was insulting. There were 2 billion small farmers globally, and the technology to fix their soil sat behind a paywall of 40 grand and a freight container. So Schmidt and Taylor sat down with a sheet of 14-gauge steel and a welder named Marcus Koller. 48 hours later, they had a cone, 1.5 meters across the top, 60 centimeters across the bottom, 90 centimeters deep, wall angle, 63 degrees, 850 liters of empty volume inside, sat it on the gravel pad behind the Ithaka office, loaded it with wood, lit a small fire on top, walked away. 2 hours later they came back. The fire was out. The interior was full of black, compacted, glittering biochar. Almost no smoke had risen from the burn. The neighbors had not called the police. The yield, when they weighed it, was about 100 kilos of pure carbon from 300 kilos of dry wood. That is roughly 33% by mass and around 40% by carbon retention. The numbers are in the published paper. Cornelissen and the team from the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute confirmed them in 2016 in PLOS ONE, peer-reviewed, citation in the description. They called the cone Kon-Tiki, after Heyerdahl's raft. The joke was that a primitive shape, made out of nearly nothing, could cross an ocean of bureaucracy and reach farmers in places like Nepal and Kenya without a single patent or license fee. Schmidt and Taylor never patented the design. They published every detail in open access on the Ithaka Journal website in 2015. The citation is there too. By 2020, the Kon-Tiki kiln was in use in more than 80 countries. By 2026, the number is larger, and nobody is counting carefully. The reason it spread so fast is not because it was clever, it is because it was old. Schmidt and Taylor did not invent the shape. They rediscovered it, the way Glaser rediscovered terra preta. There is a reason every traditional charcoal kiln in every culture, from West African pits to medieval Swedish turf mounds to Japanese rice husk chimneys, lands close to the same geometry. The shape is dictated by the physics of the flame. That is the part I want you to hear tonight. I am going to ask you to slow down for 1 minute, because if you take nothing else from this video, take this. The whole secret is in 2 layers. Above the wood, a flame. Below the wood, no oxygen. The flame on top is doing 2 jobs at once. It is burning the smoke that rises up out of the cooking wood, which is why the cone barely smokes at all. And it is using up every molecule of oxygen in the air above the wood, which is why the wood below cannot combust. The wood below cannot burn because the wood above is burning everything that would have let it burn. The flame is a curtain. Underneath the curtain, the wood does not catch fire. It cooks. It loses its water. It loses its volatile oils. It loses its methanol and its terpenes and its acetic acid. What is left is carbon. Pure, porous, aromatic, recalcitrant carbon. Biochar. That is what Schmidt and Taylor called the flame curtain. That is the heart of the cone. And that is what the shape is designed to protect. Now the question is, why a cone and not a barrel? Why 63 degrees and not 90? Why open on top and not closed? The answer to all three is the same answer, and it took me 3 readings of the Ithaka paper to see it. The cone is steep, so that the burning material falls inward and downward as it pyrolyzes. The pile compacts under its own weight. Fresh wood goes in at the top, where the flame is. As that wood cooks and shrinks, gravity pulls it down into the narrow base, where there is almost no oxygen, and where the finished char accumulates in a tight, dense layer. The narrow base means the bottom has the lowest possible surface-to-volume ratio. The lowest surface area means the least exposed char. The least exposed char means the least oxidation. You want the finished char to be smothered by more raw wood above it, and by the geometry of the cone below it. 63 degrees of wall angle does that. 90 degrees, a vertical barrel, does not. In a barrel, the wood sits in a column and air leaks down the sides. In a cone, the wood slides toward the center and the sides themselves seal off the air. The geometry is the seal. That is why a Kon-Tiki kiln, with no moving parts, no fan, no thermometer, no electronic anything, produces biochar at 20% dry yield with single-digit % smoke. A pile fire in your backyard, made of the same wood, sometimes makes biochar at 1 or 2% and produces 50 times the smoke. Same wood, same hour. The difference is the cone. The peer-reviewed numbers are worth saying out loud because they sound exaggerated and they are not. Cornelissen and the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute measured a clean Kon-Tiki burn against a traditional open pile of the same wood, same weather, same operator. The Kon-Tiki put out roughly 70% less PM10 fine particulate, 90% less carbon monoxide, 90% less nitrogen oxide, 40% less methane. Those are not margins of error. Those are step changes. They show up in the air over your yard. They show up in your neighbor's open window. They show up in the lungs of whoever is standing 30 feet downwind. The cone is not just better biochar. The cone is a cleaner fire. The cone is, in pollution terms, almost a different kind of combustion than what you were doing the last time you burned brush. And there is a thing I want you to picture. The flame, in a well-run cone, is mostly above the wood, not coming out of it. The wood underneath looks dark and red and quiet. There is heat shimmer. There is no roaring, no popping, no orange tongues licking out the sides. The fire sits in a thin disk across the top of the load, like a lid of fire, like a glowing plate, and it stays there for an hour, for 2 hours, hour after hour, while you feed it. People who have run cone kilns for years describe the sound as a low, steady hush, not a roar, a hush. That is the sound of pyrolysis without combustion. That is the sound of carbon going into solid storage instead of into the sky. There is a number that goes with the geometry. People in the field will tell you the rule is 2-to-1, diameter to depth, roughly. The Ithaka original was actually 1.67-to-1, 1.5 meters across, 90 centimeters deep. Later designs went steeper, with wall angles closer to 70. The exact ratio is not magic. The point is that it is close to twice as wide at the top as it is deep, never closer to a true cylinder. The opening has to be wide enough to feed easily and to let combustion air enter freely. The depth has to be enough to bury the finished char. 2-to-1 is the rule of thumb that gets passed around at field workshops. 63 degrees is the precise number from the original paper. They both point at the same shape. Stay with me, because this is the part where it gets practical. I am going to walk you through how to build one in your yard, carefully, with every safety step, because this is open fire, at 400 degrees Celsius, sustained for an hour or more. I will not have a viewer of mine put a finger in the wrong place and lose it. There is a reason I read this slowly. Before any of it, you need a fire-safe site. Bare soil, sand, gravel, or a concrete pad. No grass anywhere closer than 10 feet. No leaves on the ground. No tree branches over your head within 20 feet. No dry vegetation, none, within 30 feet of the cone. The cone will throw sparks when you feed it. The sparks travel further than you think. A neighbor of mine in 2022 set a hedge on fire by being 5 feet too close. The hedge cost him $3,000 to replace. You need wind under 10 miles per hour, steady. If the gusts hit 12, walk away. Wait for another day. A flame curtain in strong wind breaks. When the curtain breaks, air gets to the wood combusts instead of pyrolyzes, the temperature climbs past 700 Celsius, and you start losing carbon to smoke and gaining ash at the bottom instead of char. The wind decides, not your impatience. Daylight only. Local burn permits where they apply. The CAL Fire site has a tool for that, so does Massachusetts. Idaho, New York, every state has it. Check before you light, never alone. Adult in sight, phone in pocket, water source within reach, always. Now the cone itself. The backyard size, the version most people in the United States actually build, is 16 inches deep and 43 inches across the top, narrowing to 16 inches at the bottom. That is the size you can fit through a standard truck bed and lift with 2 people. The material is 14 to 16 gauge mild steel. 14 is a bit under 1.5 millimeters. 16 is just over a millimeter. Anything thinner than 16 warps in heat after a few burns and develops cracks at the seams. Anything thicker than 12 gauge is overbuilt and miserable to bend. You cut a circle of steel about 5 feet across. You cut a wedge out of one side. The wedge angle determines how steep the finished cone will be. For 63 degrees of wall angle, that wedge is around 120 degrees. You roll the remaining shape into the cone using a sheet metal slip roller, or if you do not have a slip roller, you bend it slowly over a heavy steel pipe with 2 people leaning into it. You weld the seam. You take a length of 3/8 inch round steel rod, bend it into a circle the size of the top rim, and weld it around the lip. That rim is structural. Without it, the cone will warp after the second burn. You weld a smaller ring of the same rod around the narrower bottom rim. That is the kiln. 2 days of fabrication, 1 good welder, 1 slip roller, $300 in materials at 2026 prices, maybe 4 if steel goes up again. Compare that to $40,000 for a commercial pyrolysis reactor. You can also buy them ready-made. The char cone, the ring of fire, the Oregon kiln. They all run between $400 and $1,200 depending on size. The geometry is the same. The cost is mostly labor and freight. Now the burn. Step 1. Site check. Every item on the safety list above. Water bucket, shovel, hose with the spigot turned on, extinguisher, phone, gloves, goggles, respirator within reach, adult in sight. None of that is optional. Step 2. Feedstock. Clean dry hardwood branches, brush, garden waste, corn stalks, bamboo, fruit prunings, roughly the diameter of your forearm or smaller, drier the better. Wood that has been sitting under a tarp for a season works perfectly. Wet wood will produce too much smoke and too little char. Never, never, never burn pressure-treated lumber. The arsenic and chromium will end up in the char and in the soil. Never burn anything painted, varnished, stained, plywood, particle board, OSB. The dioxins and the hexavalent chromium and the formaldehyde will go into the air you breathe and into the soil you eat from. The list of forbidden materials is in the description. Read it before you light a match. Step 3. Load a small amount of fine kindling at the bottom of the cone. Twigs, paper, dry leaves. Light it. Let it catch. Once it is burning briskly, add a layer of small branches on top. Stand back. Watch. This part will feel wrong if you have ever made a campfire. You do not pile wood on first and light it from the bottom. You start with a small fire at the top of an empty cone, and you add wood from above as the fire descends. The flame stays at the top. The fire burns through the new layer, then begins to pyrolyze the older layer below. The burn front moves downward through the wood, in a thin layer, like a sheet of paper being slowly fed through a slot. The Japanese call this fire front walking. The Swiss call it a flame curtain. They are the same thing. Step 4. Feed the cone. As the fire eats downward and the burning layer descends, you add new branches on top. The pile stays full to the rim. The flame stays bright and clear. You should see almost no smoke, maybe a thin wisp of pale gray. If the smoke turns thick and white, you are starving the flame. The curtain is breaking down. Add more wood. If the flame turns yellow and lazy and smoke gets dark, your wood is too wet. Pull drier pieces from the side and feed those. The kiln talks to you. Listen. There is a thing my grandmother told me once. Her father, in the Tennessee hills in the 1930s, used to bury wood in the back garden and set it to smolder under a sheet of old roofing tin. He called it cleaning the dirt. He had no thermometer. He read the smoke. White smoke? Walk away. Blue smoke? Wrong wood. No smoke? Exactly right. The soil under that garden, my cousin says, still grows the biggest tomatoes on the ridge. The shed where he kept the tin is gone. He did not need the shed. The knowledge was in his hands. That is what the cone restores. The knowledge in your hands. Step 5. Watch the bottom. Below the active flame curtain, in the narrow base of the cone, you will see glowing red char accumulating. The fragments will be black on the surface and red where they break. That is good char. If you start to see fine white ash forming at the bottom, you have lost the curtain and the char is burning to ash. That is the signal to stop feeding and quench. The temperature has run away. Step 6. Quench. When the cone is full of char and the flame on top finally goes out because there is no more wood above it, do not walk away. The next few minutes decide whether you keep the char or lose it. Take your hose, pour water through the top of the cone, 5 to 10 gallons. The cone will hiss like an angry snake and throw steam. Keep pouring until the steam stops and you see no glow anywhere inside. Stir with a long shovel. Pour more water. The first quench is to drop the temperature below combustion. The second quench is to be sure. Then you walk away for 24 hours. Char that looks cold on the outside is often still smoldering on the inside. 24 hours minimum before you move it. Cover the cone with a steel lid or a sheet of metal if you have one, to keep rain out and accidental sparks down. That is one burn. 20 to 30 pounds of charged biochar, or in volume about 35 gallons, 7 5-gallon buckets. Enough to amend a typical raised vegetable bed at the recommended NRCS rate. Enough in one weekend to do for your garden what a generation of compost cannot do alone. Speaking of which, the United States Department of Agriculture, in November of 2022, made biochar a federally recognized soil amendment under what is called Conservation Practice Standard 336, Soil Carbon Amendment. The standard requires the biochar to be produced at temperatures above 350 degrees Celsius under conditions of limited oxygen. Sound familiar? That is precisely what a Kon-Tiki cone does. The federal government, 8 years after Schmidt and Taylor welded their first prototype in Switzerland, wrote the rules of cone kilns into law and offered farmers payments through the Environmental Quality Incentives Program for doing exactly what an Amazonian farmer was doing in the year 500. 3 tons per acre minimum application rate, federal money, EQIP payments. The bureaucrats caught up to the conquistadors by way of an Australian engineer in Switzerland and a database in Washington. There is a quiet humor in that. Now here is the part that I have been holding back. It is at the end of the video on purpose, because if I tell you this at the start, it sounds like exaggeration, and by now you have stayed long enough to hear it as fact. The shape of the Kon-Tiki cone is not Swiss. It is not Australian. It is not even modern. The same shape, with the same wall angle, with the same top opening, has been pulled out of the ground in archaeological digs from Burkina Faso, from Cameroon, from the Niger River Basin, from the Mossy Highlands. The Mossi people of West Africa have been making biochar in shallow earth cones with a wall angle of roughly 60 degrees for at least 800 years. The pits are smaller, 3 feet across, 18 inches deep, same proportions, same physics. The soil around those pits, after a century of side leakage of fine char, is darker than the surrounding savanna. African terra preta, independent invention, almost identical geometry. Yakuba Sawadogo, the Burkinabe farmer who restored 4,000 hectares of degraded Sahel by reviving traditional Zai pits, told an interviewer in 2017 that his grandfather's generation had been putting fine charcoal into every planting hole. The yields with charcoal nearly double the yields without it. Same plant, same rain, same year, same farmer. The black carbon difference, the pit shape, the angle. And in Japan, the kuntan method, which I told you about briefly last time, is the cone inverted. Rice hulls are piled around a vertical chimney pipe set on the ground. The fire is lit at the base of the chimney. The chimney draws air upward through its center, but the rice hulls around the chimney sit in low oxygen smolder, around 300 to 500 degrees, for 12 hours. The end result is fine, light, porous biochar that goes back into the rice paddy. The rice paddies in Niigata have been farmed continuously for 1,000 years, with no decline in yield. The University of Tokyo measured them in 2018. Black carbon content 12 times higher than the regional average. The chimney is the inverted cone. The geometry inverts. The physics does not. 3 continents, 3 cultures, 1 angle. None of them taught it to the others. The chemistry is universal, and the geometry that the chemistry demands is universal, and so people in widely separated places in different centuries with no contact all arrived at the same shape. Schmidt and Taylor did not discover it in Switzerland in 2014. They restored it. They translated it into modern steel. They cut the wedge and welded the seam, and the cone they pulled out of the welder's shop in the canton of Valais was the same cone the Mossi pulled out of the dirt 800 years ago, and the same cone the kuntan farmers of Niigata are still pulling out of their rice paddies right now. That is what I mean when I say the shape is the hero. The men are archaeologists. The shape is the technology that the human species seems unable to fully lose, because every time we lose it, the same physics quietly pushes some welder in some valley somewhere to bend a circle of steel into a cone and try lighting a fire on top of it. Out of curiosity, out of stubbornness. Out of the same instinct that made the Mossi dig a shallow pit 800 years ago and the Niigata farmer set a chimney on the ground 1,000 years ago. I want to ask you something. In the comments, did your family ever have a method like this? A barrel with a lid, a pit with a sheet of tin over it, a stove that burned slow for days, a grandfather who said something cryptic about cleaning the dirt? Tell me, because every one of those stories is a fragment of the cone. The pieces are still scattered across the country, in family memory, in old farmsteads, in disused sheds. We are reassembling them. And listen. Before you go, a Kon-Tiki cone will give you 20 pounds of biochar in an afternoon. That biochar, if you put it into the ground tomorrow, will steal nitrogen from your beds for 6 to 12 months, and your tomatoes next year will sulk. Fresh biochar is empty. It is pure carbon with nothing in the pores. Hundreds of square meters of empty surface area per gram. If you do not fill those pores before the biochar goes into the soil itself will fill them with its own nitrogen and its own micronutrients, and your crops will lose. There is one more step. They call it charging. You soak the fresh char in a mix of compost tea and urine, or you layer it into a working compost pile for 30 days, and the pores fill with nutrients and microbes. Then, and only then, does the biochar go into your bed. I will tell you how to do that in detail next time on this channel. The compost slurry, the urine ratio, the 30-day window, the microbial assay people in Norway use to tell when a piece of char is fully loaded. There is a smell test, there is a color test, there is a peer-reviewed protocol. I have all of it ready, but that is a different video, and it is long enough to deserve its own night. For tonight you have the shape, you have the angle, you have the safety, you have the burn. You have the federal practice standard and the source citations, and the small grandfather story and the cone the human species cannot quite forget. The rest you can do with your own hands, on a Saturday in your own yard, with a sheet of steel and a welder and a forecast under 10 miles per hour. The Amazonians did it with dirt and palm fronds. The Mossy did it with a shallow pit. The Niigata farmers did it with rice hulls and a chimney. The Swiss did it in 2014 with 14-gauge mild steel. You can do it with the same steel, this autumn, on the gravel pad behind your tool shed. The shape is older than recorded history. The physics is older than the human species. The temperature is 400 degrees Celsius, sometimes a little hotter at the curtain, sometimes a little cooler in the base. The number is the same. There's a reason no one talks about this anymore, and I think after tonight, you know what the reason is. It is not because the knowledge was secret. It is because the carriers of the knowledge died, in waves, generation after generation, and the industrial chemistry that replaced them was loud and cheap and easy and dead. The cone is quiet. The cone is patient. The cone is older than the Haber-Bosch process by 10,000 years, and it will outlast every fertilizer factory currently standing. You are the next carrier. Whether you build a cone or not, whether you ever light a flame curtain in your own yard or not, the fact that you have stayed with me for the last however many minutes means the knowledge has moved from a published paper in 2015 to a welder's shop in 2014 to a mossy pit in the year 1200 to your head in 2026. That is how transmission works, person to person, slow, real, one head at a time. Out of the ash, something always grows.